You ever notice how history doesn't just march, it echoes? Patterns repeat, empires rise and fall, but the story beneath stays the same. In this episode of the Rooted Ground podcast, we're not just studying prophecy, we're tracking it. We're watching it unfold, step by step, kingdom by kingdom, from the fall of Alexander the Great to the rise of an empire born in the Arabian sands. Because the beast doesn't just rise out of nowhere. He follows a path, Babylon, Persia, Greece, each one casting a longer shadow. And then something shifts. The trail turns east into a different kind of empire, not just military but spiritual. A kingdom built not only on conquest but on a denial, a rejection not just of the message of Christ but of his identity itself. We'll talk Antiochus, the desecration of the temple, and the clash between north and south. But more than that, we'll look at the deeper thread, the prophetic pattern moving underneath all of it, a spiritual war hidden in plain sight. If you've been reading along with us, you already know this isn't just history. It's a blueprint, a warning, and a call to stay awake. So grab your Bible, settle in, and follow the tracks. Because the echoes are getting louder.
Well, thank you for taking the time for watching this video. We're here now at Chapter 3, Part 2B of the Let the Reader Understand Bible Study series. Of course, we've been following the lineage, the trail of the beast, as you could see from the subtitle there, The Footsteps of the Beast. And of course, we've been following it from Babylon to Media Persia, from Greece up to, we discussed Rome, and of course, each kingdom leaving its imprint, but each one carrying some part of that spiritual DNA of the beast, of the Antichrist. And of course, all this harkens back to the warning that Jesus gave his disciples about when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation. So we've been doing this Bible study focusing on the footsteps of the beast, tracking that. And of course, with this episode, we begin to notice that these footsteps begin to veer eastward, a eastward expansion. And by the time we're finished today, we're going to trace those eastern footsteps from the fall of Alexander to the rise of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties, all the way to a kingdom that will deny the very cornerstone of the Christian faith. And it's a kingdom not born of Rome, and we'll touch on that, but it's going to be born out of the sands of Arabia. So let's get into this, taking that deeper dive into the book of Daniel in order to follow these tracks where we need to. But in doing that, once again, let's do a quick review. We had started off looking at this in regards to the book of Revelation 17 and that beast. And of course, as we had touched on in previous episodes, that beast that thou was and is not, which was the key word here, that automatically disqualified Rome from being part of the Antichrist system. And I know that's contrary to much of what is taught today in the church world, but with what John was told on the Isle of Patmos, that beast, that Antichrist system that he was seeing come up, that beast that thou sawest was, in other words, prior to John, but is not, disqualifying again the system, the empire that put him on the Isle of Patmos. And of course, looking, we began to zoom in even tighter with Daniel chapter 2, and we begin to see that the empires with that statue that came about, the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Empire of Alexander the Great. And of course, I had asked in a previous episode, if you were to destroy the Roman Empire, would you destroy the empires that this statue resembled? And of course, looking backward, because the scriptures fully lay out that when that stone cut out without hands comes and strikes the statue's feet, it will destroy all of the previous empires before. So even looking at this, going back to that good old Sesame Street song about, and I can thank Joel Richardson for this being in my brain, but which of these is not like the other? So when you look at these maps, it's very evident that the Roman Empire does not in any way resemble what we have under the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, and Alexander the Great. So when we see that come in, it is not, once again, just like it was in Revelation 17, the Roman Empire, now by the mouth of two witnesses, cannot be part of the lineage of the beast. That spiritual DNA is not there. So once again, we started off in Revelation chapter 17. We went into Daniel 2, and each time getting a tighter and tighter focus. And if you recall, we began talking about, that the Rome is not, and I began to look at what are some possibilities in one of the previous episodes. And then, of course, with Daniel chapter 2, we tighten that focus even farther, going from the 8 being mentioned in Revelation 17 to, in all reality, 5 being mentioned, kingdoms, empires in Daniel chapter 2. And we had discussed legs of iron typically are portrayed in most study Bibles to be the Roman Empire. But as we already could see, that cannot be the case based on Scripture alone. And then, of course, if that's not the legs of iron, if the Roman Empire is not them, then what is the feet of iron and clay? Because that's where the issue comes in. So we're going to zoom in even farther and look at what's going on with this, because once we can determine the legs of iron, we then can look at understanding that the feet of iron clay, which does align to the beast that was and is not, being the 8th. So that is the key. As we get a tighter and tighter focus coming down to, in this image here that some artist portrayal, these legs of iron, if we understand what these are, coming out of the Alexandrian Empire, they will lead to the feet of iron and clay, which is in fact the beast that was and is not, and even he is the 8th that we find in Revelation 17. Why do I know that? Well, because in Daniel 2, that is this rock cut out without hands, Jesus, when he comes to set up his kingdom, will destroy that system. And of course, that aligns with other Bible prophecy, but I won't go down that rabbit trail right now. But that will take care of when the Lord comes. He will destroy the Antichrist kingdom, setting up a kingdom that will never end. So we're going to take an even tighter focus on, as these empires went forth, those legs of iron, getting a much tighter fit. And that will come in Daniel chapter 8. And of course, once again, we have Daniel having a dream, a vision. And as it states here, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, he has a dream, and we begin to see this. And out of that, we see a transition from a statue of these metals to, we see a goat and we see a ram. And so we're going to dive a little bit deeper in that. Once again, getting a finer tuned focus on what's occurring. And as we read this, and I'm going to take a little bit of time, I'm going to go through these scriptures, but if you wanted to follow along, it's Daniel chapter 8. And I would encourage you to read all of Daniel 8, but I'm going to focus in on verses 5 through 8. And he says, "And I was considering, and behold, an he-goat came from the west, and on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes, and he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him with fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand, and before him, in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him to the ground and stepped upon him and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore, the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. Sounds like a lot, but we know from history itself who this is. This great horn, of course, was none other than Alexander the Great, with the swiftness of a leopard, which can allude back to Daniel 7, and the ferociousness of, say, a lion. He came swiftly across, and the Alexandrian, Macedonian, however you want to word it from a historical perspective, came swiftly from the west. Now, when it says the west, it's not talking about the United States, it's not talking about Europe. It's referring to the Macedonian regions just westward of what we call Turkey. Asia is what it was referred to in the ancient times, came swiftly down through Turkey and the Promised Land and into Egypt and into all the way over to what we call Iraq, and struck down this two-horned beast. And of course, that was Media Persia. But his rise was fast and his fall was fast. And that is the key as we move forward, because out of him, as you'll see here at the very end, it talks about that. Let me go backward real quick. That the great horn was broken. So, and once he is broken, it came up four notable ones. And that's what we're going to touch on. But real quickly, just as we talked about before, that head of gold was the Babylonian Empire. The chest and arms of silver, the Medo-Persian, the two pieces. And of course, now the belly and thighs of brass being the empire of Alexander the Great. So what we're seeing here is the Alexandrian, the Great's empire coming against the Medo-Persian Empire. We're looking in, focusing in on that transition from the silver to the brass and what that means. But something you've got to maintain here is that spiritual DNA of the beast, of the Antichrist. Each of these empires holds that DNA. It's carrying it forth piece by piece. Just like if you were to check my DNA, you can trace my lineage back along the family tree to my forefathers. And that is the same thing we are seeing here. And once again, this is all part of the East. Everything you see here, from the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian, and that Western power piece up here here's the Macedonian area in which Alexander came from, here, and traveling so swiftly, taking all the way over to what we call present-day India. And so that spiritual DNA comes forth, but Alexander dies in Babylon as a young man. History records at 32. And that is what Daniel 8:8 talks about. It says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great goat was broken, and for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. And out of one of them, and this is key, and out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And of course, the pleasant land is the Promised Land. It's that section there, Jerusalem, and where God's going, set up his name. But what we got to remember is, as these begin to occur, when that horn is broken, four other horns came up. And me and good old AI try to put together what occurred here, that we had four empires. We had the Seleucid, and you can see a map here showing, and it refers to it as the Hellenistic kingdoms, but this was all that came out of the wars that occurred after Alexander died. And I'm sure I'm going to butcher the name here, but it's the Diadochi. It talks about the history of Alexander's successors trying to come to prominence. But we have the Seleucid, the Ptolemaic, the Lysemic, and the Cassander empires coming to power. And as these, it lasts for a significant amount of time until eventually we have two prominent that come out. Outside of that, very little. You have the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic. They're the ones, and as you can see, who's dead center between those two. And well, it's Israel and in the promised land, the pleasant land, falls between these two. And matter of fact, as you begin to read through Daniel 11, you see the historical details laid out for you of what was occurring between these two powers, these two horns that became very prominent. So in reality, what we have here is the king of the north, the Seleucid Empire, the area of Assyria, Syria, and so on, and the king of the south, the Ptolemaic empires. And what is key there is now we're down to the two being the prominent, but out of one of them comes an echo far louder than the rest. And we know that within the Old Testament and moving forward to the New, there are echoes and shadows of things to come. And what we find coming out of there, as I go back real quick, it talked about a little horn which waxed exceedingly great. We're about to see here the foreshadow of the Antichrist. And of course, I firmly believe that little horn is the Antichrist, but at the same time, we get a foreshadow of what we should expect. And it's not by placing one of our own interpretations, and I've said this multiple times, whether it be in my Bible study videos or here within this teaching, is we need to let text speak for itself, not tradition. Tradition would place, I've seen interpretations of Trump being the Antichrist, Bill Clinton being the Antichrist, but that is taking the world's modern interpretation, but not allowing the text itself to interpret what we see. And of course, what was written of old, here what we find in Daniel, these were written to a people, a place, a culture. And what they understood is how we need to understand it. It is for us, but it wasn't written to us. And that is the key. And of course, as we see this, we're told and foretold. Let me go back. Sorry if I'm making you a little crazy with the PowerPoint. But that little horn's going to come up. So there is a historical figure that rises, that mirrors and foreshadows the Antichrist. It provides the loudest echo, if you will. And that is, of course, coming out of the kingdom of the north is Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. And what's interesting here, think about Revelation 17, talking about the eighth. I'm not directly connecting these, but this once again is that whole foreshadow that the Lord gives us, and he lays down all the hints, all the clues for us to get into the scriptures and to understand them. But he is the eighth king of the Seleucid Empire, reigning from 175 BC to approximately 164 BC. Of course, you got to remember, every empire is bringing that spiritual DNA. And what we find here is, and we're going to read here quickly, what this little horn does. And it says, out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and it stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. Prince of the host, of course, is foreshadow of Christ. It's God. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And an host was given to him against the daily sacrifice by reason of the transgression. And it cast down the truth to the ground, and practiced and prospered. What we find here in Antiochus Epiphanes, was an eighth king out of the kingdom of the north. So he is coming from the land of Assyria, the land of the Seleucid Empire, the eighth king, a foreshadow of the Antichrist. And he defiles the sanctuary. He sets up an abomination that makes desolate. What we see here in Daniel 8 is, like I said, given fuller detail in Daniel 11. But this man hated the covenant. He persecuted the faithful. But he was just a signpost of what is to come. And I'm gonna look at real quickly, and this is First Maccabees, which I know some of you may get a little troubled with. Well, that's not in the Bible. Well, if you pick up a 1611 King James Bible, it is. The Apocrypha was a selection of books which were published in the 1611 King James Bible. Matter of fact, across just beyond my monitors here on my bookshelf, you'll see my King James Apocrypha. And in it, we would find First Maccabees. Well, you'd find all the Maccabees. They were in the King James Bible until 1885 when they were pulled out. But I just want to pull this piece because Matthew 24 spoke about when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. That's what this whole Bible studies is set upon, understanding what that means. And of course, when we go to the book of Daniel, we see about the abomination that makes the desolate. Where else do we find it written? Well, in First Maccabees 1:54. It says, now the 15th day of the month of Seslu, I'm sure I just butchered that, apologies. In the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. He did. The king of the north came in, set up a base. If you read the historical accounts of this Antiochus Epiphanes, he came in, took over the temple in Jerusalem. He had swine sacrificed on the altar. And of course, swine, pigs are an abomination and an unclean animal in regards to Jewish law. He did not permit the Jewish men to be circumcised. The reading of the law, the reading of God's word, the law, was not permitted. He persecuted and killed God's people. In fact, the foreshadow, the very image we need to look at. And he wasn't Roman. He was what we may consider Western for what the Jews perceive, but he came out of the kingdom of the north. He is from the Seleucid Empire, not Roman, but what we see here, and as you can see, Jerusalem in the infighting between the king of the north and the king of the south, but this eighth king of the Seleucid Empire was the very foreshadow of the Antichrist. This eighth king portrayed what we should expect when it comes to who is the Antichrist, what should we be looking for. And the region that he comes out of, it's not Rome. It's not even over here in Greece. He would be considered an Assyrian based on his heritage, but I don't want to go down that rabbit trail too far. But the key here is pulling historical elements out to be able to tie together with scripture to piece together what we're seeing. So once again, he is coming out of that Seleucid Empire, and what begins to occur is, as you see this, once again, the Ptolemaic Empire was maintained in what we call present-day Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, at least part of it, down toward Ethiopia in the northern Africa region. And Daniel 11 describes everything that's going on here, even the political marriages and the deceptions and the betrayal that goes on between the Ptolemies and the Seleucid Empire. And that is what happens because the beast always wars against the covenant. And once again, we see it caught in the middle of the king of the north and the king of the south. Matter of fact, when you go to the Apocrypha and look at the Maccabean pieces in historical records, that is where you see the Maccabean revolt taking place due to that eighth king. But then we begin to see the Seleucid kingdom weaken. As you can see, even from that map, you see the Roman Empire beginning to come in from the west, the Parthian Empire expanding from the east, and it continues to fracture, and the Ptolemaic Empire as well begins to fracture, and Rome sweeps in. Eventually, you see Rome sweep across the Mediterranean area, but never over here into the Parthian Empire, at least not to any kind of extent while it existed. To this day, the Iranians, the Persians, always brag that they were never conquered by Rome, and they weren't. They were never, ever conquered by Rome. But we got to remember something. Even though the Roman Empire came through and took this over, with what I even started the podcast out with is Revelation 17. The beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth and is of the seven, is not. Rome is not part of this. But so where are these legs coming from then? And do notice it's two. Well, what two? Well, the salute, and this is what I give to you, and you may think Nate's a little nuts, but I believe what we're seeing here is these legs of iron, and it's what Daniel 11 describes significantly, were as the Alexandria Empire fell apart to its four horns, two came out prominent, and those two, of course, were the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, and eventually leading to those feet of iron and clay. And what we see here then is what should come, and how, what when it gets to the feet of iron and clay, and that's for another podcast. But when we look at this, that's what I'm seeing here, not Rome. And if yes, Rome did separate into east and west, but it did not have a direct lineage from Babylon. Once again, go back to what we had from the beginning. Revelation 17 said the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth and is of the seven. So the Antichrist kingdom is part of the seven, but he is not. Rome was discounted. So if I throw in here, I've got Islamic Caliphate, instead of, the Rome, when we look at here, what are those legs of iron, which we'll get about and over when we come over here. But you've got to understand, it says it's got to be coming from this group. The beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth and is of the seven. It's got to come from here. That beast is coming up from rising up here. And of course, when we look over here, we've got Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then those legs of iron. And once again, what did I just say? Those legs of iron. Out of Greece came the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires, what I truly believe to be the legs of iron. And yeah, I know, once again, I'm going against much of what is tradition within the church world, but that's okay. The key is going on tradition is not the route to take. You take text over tradition. Tradition would point to the West, would point us, toward the Roman Empire and all things Europe and eventually the United States. But here it was an eastward expansion. It is looking at the Seleucid and Ptolemaic, to the point that the king of the north, the eighth king of the north, set up an abomination that maketh desolate, foreshadowing the Antichrist kingdom that we should expect. But we've got something coming. And of course, from a historical perspective, and that is that beast that feet of iron and clay that we've not dealt with yet. And of course, that's where I fully begin to look at a new kingdom rises out of all of this. That if you'll notice, those iron legs that were part of Ptolemy, part of the Ptolemaic Empire, part of the Seleucid, is leading to something eastward. Once again, not Rome. It is leading what we would eventually see rise in the 7th century. And we'll touch more about that on the next podcast. But a new empire emerges, one that is basically still in power today, but we'll touch on that even more in the future. It definitely looks at something that's not coming from Rome, but coming from the Arabian Peninsula here. And if you take a look real quick, I just put up here, it's a map of the Islamic Empire, and this is just one, but you can see, I hope, when I talked earlier about the head of gold all the way down to the belly and thighs of brass, those maps of Babylon, the maps of Medo-Persia, the maps of Alexander the Great, even the maps of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires, they are in this same region. So the spiritual DNA has to flow from the head of gold. And that is the key. And what we find here now is rising out of the sands of Arabia will come a kingdom. And one that is, by definition, anti-God, and I know that goes against much of what you hear in the media today. But it's an empire that's, once again, it's not the remnants of Rome, but it's led by a man, and in this is even debated, but a man by the name of Muhammad. What was his message? He denied that God had a son. He denied the sonship of Jesus himself. Matter of fact, the Quran in 18:4-6 says Allah has no son, and that it was a monstrous falsehood. It even says that in chapter 23, verse 91 within the Quran, that it says, "Praise be to Allah who has not taken a son unto himself." And what did John write to us? The writer of the book of Revelation on the Isle of Patmos, in his letter, 1 John chapter 2, verse 22, what does he state? John writes, "Who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son." And so hopefully you see within that, and what we'll eventually touch on is that same spirit, that spiritual DNA beginning to raise its head within a new kingdom. So as we begin to move forward, I'm going to stop here without going too much farther forward on the Islamic empires that are coming. I want to encourage you to go back over the previous videos, the previous podcasts, look into especially chapter 3, looking at each of the parts, because we've been tracing these footsteps, and we're now getting to an area that we've already hit some controversial parts, just because of I'm not looking at Rome. I'm looking to the east, and I believe this is crucial. And I know tradition within the church would say we don't need to fear of having to deal with the Antichrist and such. Well, no, we don't need to fear, but we need to be aware. If you can remember the very first in Matthew 24 itself, the very first thing Jesus tells them when asked about what are the signs of his coming and such, he says, "Be not deceived." And that is key to why Bible study is necessary. Not just Bible reading, Bible study is so that we would not be deceived. And the way we do that is to take text for what it says, knowing it was written to a people, that they were a culture, they were a place, and we need to understand the intent of what it was to be written. Once again, the scripture was not written to us, but it is for us. And so we need to take that and begin to understand and trace the steps, whether it goes against our traditions or not, and accept that, because then when, as Jesus said, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, we'll recognize it. And that's important, just as it was when his first coming. Very few were there to meet him on the temple when Mary and Joseph brought him up. Very few were there when he was born. Why? They were following their tradition and not the text. And that is key in these last days. But I'm going to end here, as always. And then, of course, in the next episode, I'm going to continue following the footsteps of the beast, this trail, watching for those final footprints, those that eventually lead to the coming of the King. So until then, I want to encourage you, keep reading, keep watching, keep listening. Yeah, the beast is soon to rise up out of the sea, but the Lamb stands on Mount Zion. In the last days, he will stand there and rule with a rod of iron. Love one another, continue to pray for one another, and until then, earnestly contend for the faith that was once delivered unto the saints.
And that's where we'll leave it for now, because the footprints don't end here. They keep moving through kingdoms and centuries, through deserts and doctrines, and every step whispers the same thing: war against the covenant, war against the Lamb. But don't miss this. If the beast has a path, so does the king. And while the sand may shift beneath our feet, Mount Zion does not. So until next time, keep your eyes on the trail, your heart in the Word, and your hope in the one who's already overcome. Stay rooted, stay grounded. We'll see you in the next episode.
Don't miss out on the latest content. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you're always the first to know when a new video drops. And if you love what you're watching, save it for later and share it with your friends. Go ahead, click now